A lot of clouds today with a good chance of afternoon and evening thunderstorms. High temperatures about 87 on the beaches, low 90s inland. Then tonight, partly cloudy, just a few overnight showers, low 74 to 78. And tomorrow, a mixture of sun and clouds and more afternoon and evening thunderstorms. High temperatures close to 90.
Quantum Sorcery was published in 2009 by David Smith, a data architect by day, sorcerer by night. You can check out his website by following the link in the description. He defines sorcery as the systematic cultivation of enhanced consciousness or non-ordinary awareness and its development in the world of deeds and objects to bring about desired results. This was my first introduction to anything Chaos Magick adjacent, and if you're not familiar, like I wasn't, let me give you a little history as I understand it. Austin Osman Spare was an early 20th century British artist who was one of the pioneering explorers of the subconscious. His techniques included things like automatic writing, automatic drawing, and sigil making, aka sigilization. He left his unpublished work to a friend, Thelemite Kenneth Grant, who resurrected the ideas a few decades later in the 1970s. In 1974, Peter Carroll took up the work in Liber Null Psychonaut, creating a new magical system independent of dogma which encouraged a free-form symbol system. And so, Chaos Magick emerged in England in the 1970s by practitioners who thought existing magical traditions were too outdated, religious, and ceremonial. They aimed to strip magic down to its nuts and bolts, leaving the individual practitioner the freedom to outfit what they saw as a more universal framework however they saw fit. Two notable mechanisms making up said framework are: 1. The idea that perceptions are shaped by belief, and 2. The idea that reality can be affected by focused will. These are some pretty common ideas in magical thinking today, so much so that I think it goes without saying, perhaps to the point where it's often forgot. But maybe this is where Chaos Magick shines, and Dave Smith is sure to elaborate with an emphasis on science. The author says, energy is nothing more than the capacity to do work. To the chaos magician, this applies to magic as much as it applies to physics, because across all esoteric traditions, results may be best explained by a simple formula. Smith says, change does not come casually. It only comes through intent and intensity. Let's further examine this idea of concentrated force. To be used for anything functional, force must first be stored. As it pertains to magic, one traditional way is to store it in a physical object. Talismans and amulets date back to ancient times, and Smith likens them to batteries which provide a sustained flow. Another example is sigilization, where they are more like capacitors which provide a focused burst. In theory, this stored energy could be a tool in the practitioner's workshop, in this case the subconscious, where the objects serve as proxies for the original intent. But there's more. Like many forms of stored energy, a specific resistance must first be overcome before it's converted, or in this case, manifested. The theory goes that whether by acquiring an amulet or creating a sigil, the conscious mind gives instructions to the subconscious mind by what Smith calls a virtual tunnel. Perhaps this subconscious directive could explain the actual power behind memes and symbols. Perhaps it's the same with reciting a mantra, or even creating a company slogan. It reminded me of something I read on corporate entities and egregores, and in that sense, the idea of creating a corporation could potentially take on a whole new meaning. Going back to what serves as resistance to one's will or specific intent, there's two interesting ideas I encountered: consensus reality and the so-called psychic sensor. While I'm pretty sure these two ideas come from different fields of study, I think they complement each other well, and Smith did right to incorporate them together in proposing this theoretical resistance to will. So let's define those important terms. Consensus reality is a term more so used in sociology. It includes any given current, paradigm, or belief by a large group of people. Collectively, these beliefs make up that particular society's view of the world, or consensus reality. The psychic censor, on the other hand, is a term I think is unique in certain corners of Western esotericism. It's a mechanism of the conscious mind which determines what limits are placed on possibility. We saw this governing aspect of the psyche in the Abyss video when discussing Freud's superego, and I think the psychic censor is at least somewhat similar. Smith says, "It is no accident that it stands in the way of the manifestation of personal will." He goes on to elaborate that it is enforced by one's culture and often includes a spiritual paradigm, where failure to submit often leads to personal sanctions. One aspect where it seems to differ from Freud's superego is the idea that besides being a governing force dealing with identity, it also filters sensory data, without which true reality would be overwhelming. To some, the trick in magic is bypassing or controlling said gate. Smith has identified two ways in doing so. One way to temporarily open up the censor is to delegate the responsibility to a higher being, something Smith doesn't really get into, but I guess such is the way of Chaos Magick. Another is to induce desire for change from the conscious to the subconscious mind once again. And as a side note, that's where the whole lust for results warning comes in. The idea is, if you're still thinking about the intent after sending it, it's still in the conscious mind and the psychic censor is activated, effectively chopping the whole operation down. Previously, we went over some ideas revolving around postmodernism in the Bridge Builders video. And just to recap, postmodernism was an intellectual discourse that took off in the 1960s, which included ideas such as subjective reality, something that possibly applies to the topics here. Moving on, Smith highlights Robert Anton Wilson and Timothy Leary, two different American researchers / counterculture figures who shared the intriguing ideas of reality tunnels and metaprogramming. Let's define those important terms. Reality tunnel is a theory that, with a subconscious set of mental filters formed from beliefs and experiences, every individual interprets the same world differently. John C. Willey's 1968 book, Programming and Metaprogramming in the Human Biocomputer, inspired Wilson in his 1983 book, Prometheus Rising, where Wilson suggested one can break down old reality tunnels and impose new ones by effectively changing filters. Practically speaking, this involves bypassing the psychic censor, which can be done through various methods such as reciting mantras, leveraging symbols, practicing self-hypnosis, leveraging certain types of meditation, or with the riskier method of working with psychotropic substances like Lily did. To me, it's kind of crazy thinking of somebody being spun and putting in big work like that. Not just in the name of self-mastery, but also science. And here's where the book really comes into its own for me. Smith suggests that it's all based on quantum mechanics and chaos theory, where physical reality is reduced to a field of probabilities, and minute changes in momentum and trajectory can induce greater effects down the road. What's funny is this reminds me of Dion Fortune, who almost a whole century earlier likened occult science to the use of pulleys and gears to gain a type of psychic leverage. Because Smith's sorcery in this book seems to springboard off of ideas in quantum mechanics, let me give a brief overview of the field as I understand it. Smith broke it down, the whole history that is, but I paraphrased with a few additions of my own to keep it tight and clean. In 1801, Thomas Young performed the now famous double-slit experiment, which demonstrated the wave-like behavior of light, which we once thought was only a particle. This was cool, but the actual idea of quantum mechanics can be traced to 1859, with Kirchhoff's law of thermal radiation from his studies on black bodies. It was later Max Planck in 1900 who theorized atoms can only absorb and emit energy in discrete packets dubbed quanta. In 1924, Louis de Broglie expanded on the original double-slit experiments involving light by showing through experiment that all particles, including electrons, exhibit this wave-particle duality. These breakthroughs and subsequent discussions led to certain theories on measurement in quantum systems, including the observer effect, which postulates that the very act of observation affects matter. In 1935, Einstein, Podolsky, and Rosen introduced the concept of entanglement, where two particles can become linked, and measuring one will affect the state of the other. However, Einstein was still a strong critic of the observer effect, mocking it as spooky action at a distance. Eventually, in 1964, Bell's theorem provided evidence which supported the idea of entanglement. Overall, these breakthroughs were all seemingly contrary to what we once thought with classical physics. Quantum mechanics suggested that the universe is non-deterministic, meaning it works with probabilities, not fixed results. It is important to note that since these early days, the non-local nature of matter at the quantum level has gained steam contrary to Einstein's skepticism. Finally, you may ask, what does quantum mechanics mean to the sorcerer? Smith gives the answer with, what if possibility and probability are interchangeable? What if there are hidden dimensions to reality where will could be exerted to supplant chance? And I think that's the whole crux of the author's efforts here, at least entertaining these ideas, especially if it works towards expanding a so-called consensus reality. Moving on. Quantum mechanics has generated a number of theories over the years. Smith notes David Bohm's implicate order, introduced in the early 1980s, which was an attempt at reconciling classical physics with quantum physics. Bohm, inspired by his interests in Eastern philosophy, theorized a hidden order operating behind the scenes of the visible physical world. He thought it to be more ultimate reality, where everything is interconnected, non-local like entanglement, a place outside of time and space and folded up into a neat little package of pure potentiality. Bohm suggested that the yet unfolded fragments of implicate order could be compared to a hologram. In visualizing the universe as a hologram, there's the notion that what we perceive as reality is a mere projection. Smith notes the analogy of a radio wave containing a moving picture, where the signal carries an enfolded order, which unfolds as a series of complete photos that, when placed in organized rapid succession, gives the illusion of video. As another analogy, holography itself happens to offer a good mock-up to demonstrate non-locality. If you take a holographic plate containing an image and cut out a small section, the small section remarkably still contains the whole image, just blurrier. If that's not trippy enough, Bohm suggested that consciousness is not just a byproduct of the brain, but rather a fundamental aspect of implicate order, where the brain acts as a receiver and unfolds reality as we know it. Despite the implications of merely receiving the data, Bohm didn't write off the concept of autonomy or free will. Instead, he proposed an active or participatory determinism to his model, where implicate order provides a range of possible outcomes, and the choices we make determine which of these outcomes is actualized. Smith draws parallels to magic while considering Bohm's reconciliation of wave-particle duality. He says, to apply this model of reality to sorcery, these abstracted particles can be viewed as symbols, which could be used to manipulate the underlying implicate order. Each fragmentary portion of reality which can be influenced will result in corresponding influence over a larger whole. With the double-slit experiment, the wave function represents all possible outcomes, but when the system is observed, the various possibilities collapsed into a single state, which was a problem for scientists trying to study implicate order known as the measurement problem. In 1957, Hugh Everett attempted to bridge general relativity with relative state theory, and in 1970, Bryce DeWitt popularized Everett's interpretation with the many worlds theory. With the many worlds theory, when one possible outcome in an experiment actually occurs, all possibilities have occurred, but only one of them happens in a universe which the observer inhibits. Smith points out that for the sorcerer, there's this notion that their will can direct them into the universe in which the desired outcome occurred. But not all methods of parallel universes are based on explaining the collapse of the state vector. Some are based on cosmology, and they came from discrepancies within something else, the Big Bang Theory. The problem with the Big Bang Theory was that it couldn't account for two things. One, the uniformity of matter and energy in the universe, and two, the observed flatness of the universe as opposed to a curve predicted by general relativity. This led to Alan Gough's 1981 theory of cosmic inflation, and subsequently Andre Lin's 1992 chaotic inflation theory. Lin tried to account for expansion by something he termed scalar fields. Scalar fields are theorized to develop through quantum fluctuations and are multidimensional areas which have a completely uniform magnetic force or electric charge. They are theorized to have a direct relationship to cooling and slowing, where some dissipate but others are enhanced by further quantum fluctuations. This leads to exponential inflation capable of generating new volumes of space, which constitute new universes. Some dimensions could be like runaway trains termed eternal inflation, so it wouldn't be many worlds but infinite. Smith wonders if this could serve as another potential lead for the sorcerer. He wonders if this inflation model of infinite worlds and cascading creation via a small impetus could take place on a personal level, such as a single conscious Q within our individual experience of reality. I would say that even to the mundane thinker, of course it does. As far as parallel versions of oneself shaping whole universes, that one's harder to prove. Nonetheless, I think Smith does well in pointing out the different scales of cause and effect, which certainly adds depth to the axiom, as above, so below, where both consciousness and reality may not only be linked, but fractal. Smith is sure to highlight this fractal proposition by reaching back to the late 1960s, when the IBM commissioned mathematician Benoit Mandelbrot began studying data sets that would lead the way to his seminal work in fractal geometry. Mandelbrot discovered a special formulaic function, and Smith says, as this calculation is run through hundreds of thousands of iterations, and the result graphed, the result is a complex shape which proposes the degree of similarity on an infinite scale. The previously discussed inflation of the universe could be one example of this mathematical process in nature, and we could find other examples of fractal structuring closer that's not so far off, from the physical shape and distance of a coastline to the branches of our own circulatory systems. Perhaps the sorcerer can borrow from the fractalist these virtual models when practicing sympathetic magic, employing energy on a small scale to affect one which is greater, using leverage, going off of one small impetus. A deterministic system is predefined by simple laws or equations. Outcomes can be calculated. Results don't vary if the variables are fixed. Chaos theory, on the other hand, involves the study of apparently random, recurring behavior in these otherwise fixed systems. In the world in which we live, a minute change in the present can have an unforeseen large effect down the road. We like to think that we can calculate the future, running a large storm through the spaghetti models to predict landfall, gauging a financial market to time our bets. But Smith says, determinism is not a simple concept to grasp. Even within a system or function that is predictable, through a large number of iterations, irregularities frequently emerge as time passes. This seemingly haunting of the system is termed deterministic chaos. While quantum systems are inherently hard to predict, larger and more tangible ones should be easier, but even then, to do so all initial conditions need to be known, and any minute change mid-course can become magnified over time through something called feedback. Smith suggests that this concept is important to the sorcerer in explaining why operations go wrong. An early suspicion of this chaos was in the 1860s, when James Clerk Maxwell noted collisions between molecules and gases could cause a progressive amplification of changes, resulting in randomness at the microscopic level. Then, in 1908, Henri Poincaré introduced what is now popularly known as the three-body problem in trying to predict the movement of three bodies in space while considering gravitational pull. What he found was that even the slightest change in the starting velocity or positioning of an object sent the entire system in a completely unpredictable direction. Unlike the more predictable two, calculating three bodies involves nonlinear computing, and it was found in the 1960s by Edward Lorenz using computers just how sensitive the variables in their exponential effects were. In 1975, James York picked up Lorenz's work and associated the word chaos with the study of deterministic disorder and coined the phrase, "Does the flap of a butterfly's wings in Brazil set off a tornado in Texas?" This became known as the butterfly effect. The conclusion to the nonlinear problem was that in order to make a long-term prediction, the initial conditions of all variables would have to be determined to infinite precision. To add to the sensitivity of the initial condition set, the introduction of uncertainty introduced into a system at any given point can also have a cascading effect. In a strange twist, it was theorized that chaos also affects time. Unlike electricity, magnetism, and gravity, the laws of thermodynamics are not reversible. Smith notes in any process in which energy is transferred, particularly as heat, some degree of the energy involved in the transfer will always be lost. In 1865, Rudolf Clausius termed this entropy. Smith says that heat is produced by the effect of random motions among particles in a system, so the measure of entropy can also be interpreted as the amount of disorder in a system. He goes on with, the irreversibility of events caused by an increase in entropy is what determines that the arrow of time goes only in one direction. Paraphrasing, in order to reverse time, the complete state of every particle in the universe would have to be known. The objective past just can't be revisited, due to the barrier of infinite entropy. The distant future can't be visited due to the inability to measure initial conditions at an infinite degree. All we have is short-range predictions. For the sorcerer, this doesn't mean that long-term results are impossible. It only suggests that such results are the creation of short-term cascades created by direct influence. The farther out in time a magical operation reaches, the less precise the control is. Perhaps they should aim higher by leveraging more short-term efforts. Smith goes on with turning his attention to a few theories surrounding human consciousness. He starts by noting that although the physical structure and electrical activity in the brain has been mapped, very generally mapped, I'll add, the ultimate nature of consciousness and self-awareness largely remains a mystery. Let me give another brief rundown. Alpha waves in the brain were discovered in the early 1900s by Hans Berger, using his EEG technique. One strange observation in psychology around the same time was the concept of brainwave entrainment, where a synchronization of brainwaves with an external stimuli such as flickering strobe lights or audio tones could produce altered states of consciousness. Through the century, more types of waves were discovered using the EEG technique, and research surrounding brainwave entrainment progressed as well. Could this validate transcendental practices from the centuries-old esoteric traditions, or is it just another mysterious byproduct of things we fully don't understand? Trying to further explore the mechanisms of human consciousness, Smith returns to the holographic model in Carl Pribram's 1946 study, where memory is non-localized in the brain, that is, spread throughout. His holonomic brain theory suggested that it's not individual impulses that recall an event, but an action that takes place over the entire network called a spread function. This network flashes in precise ways, creating unique interference patterns similar to the previously discussed patterns recorded in holographic plates, where data is both recorded and recalled. In the lab, the spread function of memory was tested by shuffleboarding the brains of salamanders and lobotomizing those of rats who were trained to run a maze. No matter which quadrant of brain was removed, the rats retained the memory of the successful route. This is obviously more ethically questionable than John Lilly's LSD dolphins, a topic for another day. But speaking of Lilly, a competing theory involving consciousness comes from the Psychonaut himself. Once again, he saw the brain as a biocomputer, where any learned behavior can be altered through metaprogramming. Basically, the theory states that there are countless programs learned through experience over time, and the sum of it all in the biocomputer comprises the mind. From these programs, a smaller set of symbols or metaprograms emerge as subsets, which govern the lower hierarchy making up the ego. In his model, metaprograms are analogous to the software, where the brain is the hardware, hence the idea that it can be reprogrammed. As a fast fact, Lilly's work in 1954 involving isolation tanks and sensory deprivation went on to inspire the 1978 novel turned to film, Altered States. Besides holographic or biocomputer models, some scientists turn to the possible quantum-level processes in the brain to explain consciousness. One theory was OR, which suggested that consciousness arises from quantum events that occur within microtubules in neurons. According to this theory, these events, called objective reduction, result in the integration of information and the emergence of subjective experience. Here's another quantum-based theory. The Bose-Einstein condensate model suggested that atoms could reach a condensed phase quantum state if cooled to near absolute zero, but Herbert Froelich substituted high energy rates in a metabolic system to make similar, coherent effects in microtubules at environmentally normal temperatures. He called this a pump system. Likening the microtubules to a biological superconductor that doesn't need to be freezing, coherent oscillations could theoretically take place, allowing for the transfer of quantum information, which could explain consciousness. All of these theories could be wrong, but at the very least, studying them could garner a greater appreciation for how consciousness might be propagated outward. They could also lead to further study. Overall, Smith says, having some concept of how the self originates and how it relates to that which is not the self can be a useful tool for understanding how reality may be manipulated in both the subjective and phenomenal worlds. After looking at several models for the universe and different theories on how consciousness occurs, Smith considers possible hidden connections between the two. Once again, sympathetic magic involves an established link between the real-world entity and a symbolic representation. And one question to ask is, how might the mind affect the outer world, even while foregoing the performance of classical ritual? Going back to the nuts and bolts again, the idea is that like attracts like, and Smith, perhaps because of his professional background, believes this link is informational in nature. He favors data of the wave type, that is, analog, and he thinks there could be at least one clue from the comprehensive yet highly criticized P.E.A.R program at Princeton University in the 1980s. The purpose of the program was to study the effects of human consciousness on sensitive electronic devices, and to do this, researchers employed REGs, or random event generators, to use with participants. The experiments took place over the course of 12 years, involving 91 operators in 2.4 million trials. The results suggested that, although the influence exerted at the individual level is small, a strong overall relationship exists between operator intent and an actual achieved influence. Smith finds similarities between Austin Osman Spars' sorcery and the P.E.A.R experiments interesting, notably a stronger correlation between positive results or in P.E.A.R's case, psychokinesis, with individuals who are able to relax into a mild hypnosis. P.E.A.R called this a neither-neither state, where it's like a vacuity of mind, a place bypassing the psychic sensor, while P.E.A.R researchers described the conscious mind passing its intent to the unconscious, with the unconscious having the ability to penetrate implicate order or quantum foam. Perhaps either of these theories could be the framework behind effective sigilization. Perhaps they could be talking about the same thing, but in different words. As one more lead, it may be important to note that the most successful operators of the REGs describe a sort of bonding with the machines, or what some called resonance. Smith is sure to highlight the fact that we have already been dealing with this factor, from models of physical reality such as Bohm's implicate order to those for consciousness like OR. Maybe quantum explanations are sensitive to resonance as they deal with waves. Whether it be by bypassing the psychic sensor or working with quantum foam, for sorcery to work, information would need to travel. There would have to be a tangible carrier. Smith says that the information contained in such a packet would need to consist only of intent, distilled down to its most primal and concentrated form. Regarding this wave-like data transfer, he wonders about some of the entrainment processes, imposed by a theoretical and once again, highly criticized subject of study, the human energy field. This concept has been present for thousands of years in a number of cultures, from the Chinese concept of qi to the 17th century philosophy of vitalism. These ideas of a supposed energy field surrounding all living things have penetrated magical systems as well. Franz Bardon's neo-hermeticism is one good example that I like because of personal familiarity. Smith went on to discuss the scientific history, or pseudoscientific history if you want, of auras in life force. He said that in the 20th century, biologists discovered faint radiation emitted from plant cells. Eventually, biological energy research progressed, and a difference in coherence between healthy and cancerous cells was observed. In 1999, Fritz Albert Popp theorized that this radiation was fundamental to cellular development and intercellular communication, and because coherent light has a better capability to transmit data without loss, think like fiber optics, he theorized that metabolic activity in biological systems is actually governed by a biophoton field. Now, besides autonomic functions, other studies explored the possibility of a person's voluntary regulation of this photonic and electromagnetic output. In the late 1990s, Professor William Tiller retired from Stanford and continued his research on the possible effects of human consciousness on foreign systems. His studies claim to have shown quantifiable influence in things such as the pH of purified water, the thermodynamic activity in enzymes, and the development speed of fruit fly larvae. He theorized that besides our familiar form of reality consisting of particles and forces, there lies a subtle vacuum state which is subject to manipulation via direct action from human consciousness. It's prudent to note that while these experiments may have been conducted under the proper scientific rigor, the theories presented by Tiller are not widely accepted in academia, and the field of psychoenergetics is currently classified as pseudoscience, in the main. Nonetheless, the last model Smith proposes to explain how intent can be carried without involves a direct non-local interference between human consciousness and reality on a quantum level, independent of both time and space. He wonders if the division of self and remaining universe is a construct of the human ego, and theorizes, as the states of photons within the coherent field of the brain are altered by the encoding information and intent, their entangled counterparts outside of this field are correspondingly altered as well. Speaking of entanglement as poked at by the term spooky action, Smith says that if information can travel faster than the speed of light, there's the possibility that information is already present in all places and is not actually traveling at all. What's up, y'all? Sorry for this impromptu outro. A little bit of a crash landing, or emergency landing. A few things. One, I didn't cover the most important part, the practical section. for good reason. You can buy the book yourself, or like I did, check it out through the library. Hoopla is what I use. 2, although this book was written a while ago now, a lot of these things are very much pertinent. Matter of fact, I get news updates every day on like quantum science. I'm not gonna act like I am an expert. It just blows my mind. I'm like, God damn. And 3, a little quote I ran across. Don't know where it came from. Hold on, let me get this somewhere if I can. Great minds discuss ideas. Average minds discuss events. Small minds discuss people. So in that spirit, quit gossiping, get your work boots on, and get your ass to work.